HolonIQ maps and tracks the education market. One of the wonderful things about education, and also its Achilles heel, is that it is huge and very fragmented, incredibly important in its context. And that means things are happening on the ground in every city in every country around the world. It's very difficult to track this market, to understand what's going on. And so we 8 or so years ago identified this. I've been working in higher education for 25 years. We identified this issue. Everybody wanted to understand the bigger picture, the trends, because it's so difficult to track. And so that's HolonIQ's raison d'etre is to pull together those pieces of data essentially and identify what's happening and what that means and how that connects to other things. And it enables sharing of practice, actually. And so that's part of what we do and how we work with universities. The Higher Education Digital Capability Framework was built because most technology frameworks are built from the tech side. You know, they talk about infrastructure and things like that. What we wanted to do was bring the language of education, of teaching, learning, and the student experience into the technology space first. And so the digital capability framework is coming from a base of mapping the student life cycle. And so it's, built into 4 sort of segments that follows the student life cycle and also a university education value chain in a way. So starting with demand and discovery. So what products or what courses should we build? What are people looking for? How do we market to students? How do we, enroll them and engage them and get them into our university? How do we help them choose courses, etc.? How do we design for digital? How do students experience digital? And at the other end, how do we engage our alumni? How do we engage lifelong learning and so on? So we built it on that sort of student life cycle framework. The idea is that this framework and the elements of it are very familiar to universities. They understand every segment of it. But when you put it together, the idea is for universities to be able to look at this framework and think, if we had to or wanted to, or were already starting to move digital across our whole, area of operation, what are all the elements we need to consider? How do we inject digital into student services, which traditionally have been done on campus? How do we inject digital into our pedagogy design? And so that is complex because there's a lot going on there. Every department of the university, and they don't always sort of work completely together. They're sort of separate. How do you look across that whole framework and think, where do we want to digitize? Where is our priorities? What do we need to consider? And so the framework was built to give that bird's eye view for universities and allow them to have conversations internally about, wow, we need to focus on that element or that one, or let's all talk about this, segment, because often these conversations are happening in different departments, but they're not happening across departments. And anyone who's ever done anything to do with digital transformation knows that one of the key challenges is that it has to be seen from an integrated perspective. You can't build it by bits. And so that was the idea of the higher ed digital capability framework.
And you made a point earlier that I loved about the framework being helpful for sharing best practices between institutions, because I've already seen that in my conversations with a few institutions. I've seen them actually refer to it and actually talk about it in the context of, we're looking at, enrolling students and how do we attract students, and we're comparing what we're doing with another institution. So a framework that allows for comparison. Whereas in the past, it was so difficult to compare what efforts are happening or what area you're working on. And as you said, or it came from a technology point of view, where folks just talked about, let's improve our CRM. But the CRM touches on every aspect of the framework. So as a technology by itself, you're not really capturing the business process that is being impacted.
You know what? I think that's exactly the right word. I mean, maybe an uncomfortable word in universities, but business processes. Mapping the workflow, because what happens, unfortunately, in big organizations everywhere, and universities in particular, I guess, is that the only individuals who see a student journey all the way through are the students, because all the departments do their own thing. And so this was an attempt to support that conversation cross departments, cross workflow, and identify, well, the gaps, obviously, but also create, to some extent, help create an internal language, a common language of areas for segments for digital attention, let's say. And that doesn't mean you have to digitize absolutely everything, but you can make choices if you know what you have the scope. And so that's why we built that framework.
And before we move off this topic, I think one question I wanted to ask was, when you talk about everything that you're monitoring, the scope of HolonIQ, how many countries, how many institutions, can you give some numbers in terms of the scale so folks listening can actually understand the breadth of this?
Yeah, sure. So we started with the global perspective in mind, because actually the innovations and changes and initiatives, policy that are happening in geography A can be very relevant to geography B. And so we monitor and map all around the world. And, for example, the university's system in South Korea is very interested in what's happening in Europe. And they do have some amazing initiatives, which others can learn from. And so firstly, we map it globally. If you wanted to understand what's happening in Japan or Korea or Brazil, you can. The other thing is we build on different types of data. What organizations are doing? Who are they partnering with? In what areas? What's happening in the policy landscape? What's the implication of that? Who are all these new players that are trying to disrupt certain parts of the market? And so we have around 15,000 or 20,000 education technology companies in the platform. What are they doing? Where are they operating? What are their products? What services are they offering? Who are they partnering with? We track all the capital flows, where investment money goes, whether that's grants, government grants or other grants, or investment from investors or from philanthropic organizations. Where is the capital flowing? Because somebody somewhere has decided that that segment is worthy of investment. So it's worth watching what happens there. And investment also creates a market sometimes and growth. And so we track all those different types of capital. And we have every day, we bring in something like 5 million data points into the platform every single day, because there's so much going on. But these data points are sometimes quite small. This is a university in, the UAE, building and launching a chatbot for students. So, one tiny little data point, but you bring in 1 million of those every day. And the key is not the data. I mean, everybody knows there's lots of data around. It's actually how you can make sense of that's the important thing. And so our taxonomies in developments, our taxonomies in geographies, our taxonomy in finances help to structure all this data. And so people can start filtering and saying, I want to understand what's happening in higher education in the UAE. What are all the partnerships that are happening? What are the policy things, and so on. Everyone's interested in India. Well, can we partner in India, or is there a market there? What's the international landscape look like? Who's doing what? Where is it heading, etc. And so we're talking about billions of data points that we try to structure, or we do structure in a way that can make meaning for our customers, essentially.
And I think that's highly relevant for us. I mean, we have campuses all over the world, usually on military bases, right? So it's kind of Americans abroad. So we cater to, but we're also across the US. But I love the idea. I was listening to our president recently talk about what he's observing at our Japan campus through our partnerships with Japanese universities. And they're doing some innovative things around workforce and workforce ed and internships built into the degree that he wants to see come back to the US. So this idea of looking internationally, I think, would be a big use case for us. We'll be looking internationally for ideas that we can then automate and build into our processes in the US. That will be very exciting for us. So we're really excited to leverage all of the data that you're providing.
Absolutely. And you reminded me of some things that are happening right now, particularly in relation to work integrated learning. India's national education policy was updated a few years ago, and they just brought out last week the new sort of updates to the policy and so on. And India have mandated internships in all undergraduate programs. Now, India is a fairly big country. I mean, it's got the most population in the world and a very big focus on education. That is a significant policy to mandate internships in undergraduate programs.
And to just show how the trend follows, right? So in Maryland last year, they just basically, it wasn't mandated, but set as a goal that we would get to 45% of high schoolers going into internships by 2030. So as you look
It's
at how
amazing.
that translates, so it's a
When you start
global trend,
yeah.
but it's mandated in India, but coming slowly in the U.S. I heard in California they've set a goal of 200,000 internships by 2030. So ambitious numbers are being put out there. We have a 60,000 internship number here in Maryland for 2030. Overall, the potential of the U.S. to get to hundreds of thousands. They said the maximum potential is 800,000 in the U.S. So I'm really fascinated. A lot of folks are saying this is the decade of the apprenticeship, that it's going to transform everything we see in higher ed. Either through an internship or an apprenticeship, you're adding work experience to learning to enhance the validity of the skills at the end of the process.
Mm. I absolutely agree. These things, when you connect the dots and look at government policy across different, you can see that this is a movement. It's underlying shift, really. And this has immense consequences for higher education, who have traditionally been a little separated, education first and then work. And, we have a significantly changing global labor market. Labor markets are getting very tight, particularly in developed countries. And so when you've got a very tight labor market and people can't find, high level sort of workers, professional workers, the luxury of 5 years at a university with no work, I think policy is going to change around this. Incentives will change first, policy will change second, and of course what comes with policy change is funding change. That's part of the incentive mechanism. So we're going to see this deeper integration of work and education impacting traditional models of higher education and causing initially challenges because of the whole way that higher education is built and the way that universities are constructed. Despite the fact that every day we see lots of change, sometimes it feels like things take decades to actually change in a systematic way. And so I would say, and higher education is not the same in all parts of the world. Higher education is reflective of the environment in which it sits, the labor environment, the economic environment, the demographic environment. And so what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Japan is different to what's happening in the US, and it will remain different. There is an underlying shift in all of those markets towards this sort of work integrated learning degree apprenticeships, different models. But the speed of these things will differ. And so I would say, though, that in a decade, if we were having this conversation in a decade, and actually I hope we are having this conversation in a decade, if we look back on the last decade, if we're sitting here in a decade, we will see that work integrated learning, and not just go off and find a job for 3 weeks and come back, really deeply integrated into the design of degree programs in one way or another. Now, that could be via internships that are formalized and required, and lots of partnerships with industry. It could be in formal degree types, i.e. degree level apprenticeship style programs, etc., will be by a decade the norm. Compared with today, which is, or even 5 years ago, the early adopters of this were, the presidents of universities were getting on podiums and saying, we're going to have work experience and integrated learning in every single course. Now that took different, you could do a case study or you could do a work, all different things. That was aspirational. But in a decade, we're going to see this normal. So from novel to normal, I would say, in a decade. But
You also saw it only in specific pockets like healthcare, where internships were required, or licensure was regulations around licensing requirements were requiring work study programs or real world experience. But now you're starting to see it as just better learning, kind of like ubiquitous acceptance, and then it permeates a lot of other roles. I was also reading recently about the pathway to blue collar versus white collar. And that has a big factor here. So where integrating work into learning was actually much further embraced in construction and other real-world life skill areas, there's this kind of protection or bubble around traditional white-collar professions that were the hardest, IT and others, but are now starting to gradually move over to embracing internships and apprenticeships.
that's exactly right. It's easy to, and most people segment, like you said. So, yes, those models are for those types of professions. But actually, you're right. It's the normalization across the whole experience, really, that we're going to see. But it'll take a while, and it'll be fast in some areas and slow in others, depending on the geography, depending on the profession, like you say. So the models are there. They're just not applied universally as yet.
And I know that some analysts and futurists out there are kind of projecting that time frame, and they're saying when will we see this shift impacting higher ed enrollment? Is one of the questions that we're trying to ask, because UMGC is part of the USM system, so we have 12 traditional brick and mortar universities and one online in our system, and what we're seeing is all of the brick and mortar universities are now struggling with enrollment. We've seen a 1% to 2% decline consistently over the last 5 or 6 years. And UMGC, our online school, is the only one that's growing right now and growing significantly this year. So that shift is already evident. What we're trying to predict is, will it accelerate?
I think what we're going to see is, firstly, there's a complex underlay to that phenomenon that you just talked about, which is traditional brick and mortar universities struggling with enrollments and online growing. So there's a number of elements underneath that are driving this. And so in the US, one of the elements that is driving this is demographics, just in terms of the number of kids coming through to go to college, number one. Number two is competition. That might be not a pleasant word in higher ed, but let's go with credible alternatives.
That's a good way to look at it, yeah.
And so over the last, 5-10 years, we've seen credible alternatives that get you jobs. And so the vast majority of people, even though it may be unpleasant to many in higher education, want to go to university to get a better job and have a better life. And so there are now credible alternatives to that objective. And so things chip away at a model that's worked for a long time. Many things chip away at it, and they're two of the things that have chipped away at it. At the same time, the world has made a turn. We can't underestimate public perception, let's say. And so there's public perception about credible alternatives being okay. 10, 15, 20 years ago, if you didn't go to college, you're a failure. But that's really not the case anymore. And it's not the case from governments either. The UK, many countries, most countries have or had a target for higher education participation rate, right? And so the UK's higher education participation goal was 50%. It wanted 50% of its population to go to higher education. Now, in 2020, 2019, 2020, 2021, they officially abandoned that target. This is a significant statement by a government. And the reason was that target is no longer relevant. Okay. And so, because if you have an apprenticeship or another qualification, that is good too. It's not zero sum anymore, even from governments. And when they start saying things like that, they start to route funding to these alternatives, some of which are these apprenticeship programs or, you know, short courses that in certain areas and so on and so on. And so we're starting to see a mind shift in parents and in people about credible alternatives. And everybody loves to have a zero sum. It's like, oh, universities are hopeless, they don't get you jobs. Well, they do, you know, and the other is not any good. Well, they are, so I think the world is changing its opinion of things, and that counts for a lot.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think if I look at I was educated in the UK, but then came to the US after postgrad, and when I study the US model, this aspiration that 100% of high schoolers must attend higher ed or institution, and at its peak, I think back in 2009, we hit our peak where it was almost 80% of high schoolers enrolling in a higher ed institution within a year of graduating. And you saw this incredible momentum built up over the last 40, 50 years since World War II to get everyone to go. But now we're starting to see the almost 2 trillion in student debt,
Yes.
the completion rate at less than 50%. So what you're looking at is almost like a failed social experiment where
Yes.
you got millions of students to believe that they needed a pathway, but a lot of folks are doing okay by finding alternatives, but now they're saddled with the debt of a failed attempt.
Yeah.
And so now we're course correcting, I think, as a country. But it's interesting to hear that UK analogy, because even in the UK, they were adopting similar thinking that everyone needs to go. And it's a great stat that over 50% of your students are pursuing higher learning. But the market wasn't bearing that out. And it's like now we're seeing the reality. One thing that you touched on, though, is you look at these different countries, there's also the government funding model, right? So as I look at Australia and countries like Germany, where higher ed is paid for, probably have a very different outlook on this, because they may not have the same challenge we have with private student debt. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so many countries in the world have a significant government contribution to higher education fees. I mean, in Australia, it's a co-contribution. And so students still pay, definitely. The government pays for 2/3 and the students pay for a third or something like that. And then they tweak the percentage depending on what they want students to enroll in. So if you wanted to enroll in a teaching degree, because teachers are critically short in all, then you almost pay nothing yourself. Whereas if you wanted to enroll into, I don't know, a history degree, you pay a lot, which is crazy. But anyway, there's crazy policies all around the world in relation to higher education funding. In Germany and Nordics and many other countries, education is fully paid for by the state. And so you do get these different dynamics. But at the same time, those markets, you can't just take that one stat, because those markets route kids into higher or different further education from age 15. And so by the time you're 15, if you're in Germany, Switzerland, or Austria, and so on, if you're going into higher education, which it's more science and research and the original higher education, the original, if you wanted to go into professions, you go into a different type of institution. Or if you want to go into apprenticeship, you have to go into a third stream. And so they already stream early. And so those who are going into that higher education are going to be scientists and,
Researchers.
researchers and so on. Yes.
Very different. Yeah. So we like to take nuggets out of that and say, okay, well, state funded, but what they're not realizing is that there is a way to set pathways early on. I saw that with IB as well. So there are IB schools now growing rapidly in the US in high school. But the challenge with IB is that in Europe, there is IB for 2 different tracks. And IB has
Yes.
had a hard time bringing their vocational track IB to the US, because the US was finding this is very unusual. I thought everyone was aspiring to go to college. And they're saying, no, there are 2 distinct different IB pathways.
Yes. So the only other point I would make here is that we've talked about these underlying sort of shifts. Policy and funding take a while, that there's a lag. starting with everybody, all parts of the market think everyone needs to go into university. So that starts to change. Like you say, there's been some changes in the market, some failed experiment, whatever. Then all these alternatives come up, and often the first alternatives are pretty bad. In any sort of innovation, the first alternatives to something are usually not so great, but they get better and better and better and better and so on. And then new models, and then they become credible, and then people start to say, oh, actually, maybe there are, but still funding and policy is still lagging that. That's why it's going to take another 5, 7, 10 years. However, we already are seeing some changes in government opinions, and that follows to policy and so on. I'll give you an Australian example, which I think is very relevant. It's only it's one of these tiny little data points that are indicative of bigger things. And it might be the same in the US. There's different laws governing higher education and apprenticeships, trades, skills. And so you have to be accredited or endorsed in the law to call something an apprenticeship. It's not, you just can't build one and make it happen, right? And so certain professions are in that zone and have been ticked off in law as, yes, that is able to be an apprenticeship. And so that constrains, because it's plumbers and electricians and, hairdressers and so on. And so you want to have tech apprenticeships. You want to have professional apprenticeships, but actually the law doesn't allow it. You have to change the law or some little aspect of the law in order to allow it. And so in South Australia, which is just a state in Australia, earlier this year, they changed a part of the law to officially recognize a Bachelor of Science in artificial intelligence and computer engineering as a trade. Now, only a tiny little thing, but it's like, okay, we're starting to see tweaks to the law allowing this. I think that's interesting.
Yep, and then in the US too, it's traditionally fallen on two different departments in the government, right? So the Department of Ed and Department of Labor traditionally have not had a lot of joint legislature. And now you're starting to see, we have new apprenticeship companies that the university is partnering with, but they have to be certified by the Department of Labor and then cross over now to actually offer new types of funding programs. And you're seeing commerce, labor, and education for the first time discussing how they roll out these programs together. And what's unusual is in the state of Maryland, we just announced that for the first time, the governor is asking all of those departments to collaborate on their 5-year planning. Just because of ushering this new era is going to require significant coordination, and it's the first time ever they're all going to announce their 5-year plans at the same time in January, because they have to align on changing Maryland's workforce.
Yes, and I think those geographies, whether they be states or countries, that can coordinate across economic development, labor, and education are going to get there faster. And we see this in examples like Singapore, where they're super coordinated in all their government departments. And so they're way ahead of the game because of that underlying sort of structure that allows mechanisms for faster decisions. Yes. I want to frame this with a bit of philosophy first, sort of philosophy. So higher education and a university education is very worthy, number one. So something that is worthy doesn't need to be destroyed in order to modernize. And so I want to make sure that the people listening understand my approach, which is higher education. A higher education is incredibly worthwhile and very, very important to the world. We shouldn't modernize it to the point that it's not that we lose the thing that gives it value. And so I think for all higher education institutions, for governments, and for people, the population writ large, an understanding of what it is, the things that make higher education and university education incredibly important need to be very well understood and kept. and not changed. Now, what's happened over the last 50 or 60 years is that the world decided that higher education was the vehicle for everything. And so it will get good jobs, all jobs, everyone, the economy, everything, everybody. One vehicle will be able to do all this. And of course, nobody realized it at the time. Everyone thought, wow, that's great. We've got a higher education. But the consequences of that, we've sort of just talked about. But we've pushed everything into the one wheelbarrow. And so I think it is time for higher education to be very, very clear on its value and to double down on those things, despite the pressure for change, whether it be technology-led or market-led. Change does need to happen, but not changing because, okay, we need to turn into some, we're a university, we've got great research, we add value in these ways, and now we're going to turn ourselves into a vocational vehicle. I don't think that's going to work. And so even if there's market demand, so universities have to make sure when they're restructuring, reorganizing, digitizing, that they are very clear about how the way they do that, for what purpose, without losing the core of the thing that makes them very valuable. Otherwise, they've thrown themselves into a commercial market with any old educational training provider, and they're not going to win if they're just thrown into that ocean.
Yeah, I see. Just listening to what you're saying, it's like, for me, there's this opportunity for us to actually really create different pathways within this broad universe of higher ed. Because you were describing the what I'd call the Tier 1 university model, which is where the Tier 1 university model is very valuable to society, but it's not for everyone. It never has been for everyone. Traditionally, every society has decided what percentage of their students goes to a grande école in France. It's like it's not for everyone. They test to get in. There's limited enrollment. So what we have to do is move away from this one-size-fits-all thinking, and then start to figure out, how do we create different types of institutions, different types of post-secondary or higher learning that prepares the workforce of tomorrow, but provides those alternative channels.
Absolutely, I totally agree. There has been a one goal for every institution of any type, of any size, of any foundation.
Yeah,
and
everyone
so
wants to be Harvard.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. But can I say one other thing? Even the definitions of Carnegie are changing.
Correct.
So they're also broadening, because even the people who built the structure of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, whatever, they're also seeing that this is not the way of the future. And so we're going to see more diversity of mission, diversity of structure, diversity of type, diversity of let's say, value, rather than all seeking to be look the same.
Yeah, and those old definitions are geared, it's almost like self-regulating, what does it take to go in these various tiers, but now you're saying, no, society's asking these institutions to provide something very different. And they look at the outcomes of the student. I think one of the shifts I've been observing is the evaluation now being placed on the student outcome. So when I look at what's happening in North Carolina here, where they're saying even community college funding will now shift to reflect the impact on student outcomes, and they're trying to get a better feedback loop for what's happening to their students 2, 3, 4 years beyond graduation, so they can then allocate more funding to community colleges that are serving the economy better. That's fascinating to me. That's a huge shift in thinking about the purpose of that institution.
Exactly. And that's not to say, so universities, there will be research intensive universities. There will be more workforce enablement type universities. That's what I see, some more diverse. So universities are not all one thing. I see that coming, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that's the point you made also about new things come in and they always are lower quality to begin with. because they're responding to a market need. And given our new agile product development approach, new products come out there and they haven't been fully tested. The market then declares who's the winner. And the market beats up on these products and results in better iterations of those products over time. And what we're starting to see is the rise of these new viable alternatives getting better and better. We had a whole series of boot camping and coding boot camps and companies, some passed, some failed. But over time, that model is refining itself. We talked about the MOOCs, the era of the MOOCs. Everything was about MOOCs 5, 6, 7 years ago. And that's also evolving and changing because that capability is now being integrated. I said like MOOCs disrupted more like textbooks or learning methodologies than they disrupted the institution. It's not saying that it wasn't a bad thing, it's just that it comes out and then we figure it out. I think that over time, what we're going to see is the true test is going to be determined by the outcome, the quality of the student's skills and competencies at the end of your program. And as we get better data insights on that, so that's where I'm really excited about the developments in AI and big data analytics applied to outcome analysis and outcome measurement. That's going to then create a much more accurate feedback loop that's going to tell an institution these programs are working or not faster. Mm-hmm. Right now, that takes way too long. It's like years and years of broken feedback loops with self-reported data that doesn't give us this accurate reflection on, is this program working? Is it meeting the need of an employer? Should we produce more students like this?
Yes, absolutely. I would say your point around boot camps and MOOCs and models and so on, and initially they don't really work and people write them off. I would say exactly the same law applies or rule applies to online education. So early days of online education, I mean, I started delivering online programs in 1996. They were pretty bad. And even now, some, even in government and policy and so on, say online learning doesn't work. It's like, well, okay, that's a mode of delivery. It's the design of it that doesn't work, not the actual mode. So I would say there's still, the world still, and technology plays a role in that, because if you've got ordinary technology without synchronous, ability to engage and so on, engagement's very hard. We know engagement's important for learning. So, technology definitely plays a role in that, and that's come leaps and bounds in the last 20 years. But there's still a lag in stuff like, online learning, I don't think it really works, and, But there's a whole generation of teachers and academics that just don't even know how to approach design in online learning. And I think the last few years and the next decade is going to be the era of the world putting their arms around real quality design for online engagement and online learning and online outcomes through online medium. We're still not there in education, but if you look at gaming and other things, they're sort of getting there faster.
Yeah, it's getting there fast. I mean, and before this is a great topic to kind of delve into a little bit, because I know we jumped into this, the shift happening towards skill-based learning and work. But in terms of the traditional learning experience, the digital learning experience, what are you observing in terms of growth? I mean, you mentioned AI chatbots is one thing, but I've seen, I met with the CEO of Transfer last week, talk about VR and how VR is transforming that simulation of real activity. He showed me the lab where they were operating on a patient on the table and with the VR headset, and you can actually feel like you're there. So this idea of immersive simulated experiences, no one can deny that flight sims help train pilots. Yep. So it's like, so as you say, like digital doesn't work, it's silly, because now with the right technology and the right capability, that learning experience can be dramatically enhanced and more cost effective and accessible.
Look, I think the applications of simulated learning and immersive is still a little further out, but simulated learning, particularly in any sort of high stakes environment. I mean, they've been training simulation in the military for many, many years, and as you say, pilots. But now it's becoming mainstream. So just literally this quarter, just this year, two things happened, one of those little data points that are meaningful. Cornerstone On Demand, which is the largest learning management system in the workforce learning space, corporate learning, acquired a company called Tailspin. Tailspin is like simulated learning environment. And so this speaks to me that their corporate customers in the world is huge, are seeking different types of learning environments and experiences for all the types of content that they deliver, which is all sorts, for workforce upskilling. And so that's one thing that happened. So expect to see that further. These are now these credible alternatives we're talking about, right? The other thing that happened, which I think is even more interesting, only a week or two ago in the US, the National Board of Medical Examiners, probably pretty conservative sort of area, they acquired a company called MedVR Education. They are a medical virtual reality education provider, simulation provider. This means that the medical board of examiners is starting to build testing for medical professions in immersive learning and simulated learning. So this is the most conservative, probably, learning and testing environment, because it's very important, in terms of the area they work in medicine, are now acquiring and building capabilities in simulated learning and probably testing.
That's so important, right? If they said the assessment, the tail and the dog, right? It's like if the assessment shift, the entire learning space shifts. So if the assessment now requires some type of simulated real world assessment, you can see hours now of training in simulated environments are going to be necessary
Yes.
to be assessed.
Yes.
So because
and
they're
you know
going to
what?
be testing real
Sometimes
skill.
it comes from the end backwards. And so workforce upskilling, workforce training, workforce testing in professions is using simulated learning. And this is going to become normalized. It can go faster in workforce training and upskilling and professional education than it can in formal accredited education. Things can go faster. But then that becomes the norm, and the demand for that pushes way back into higher education. So we're going to see some of that too.
And especially if it removes that taboo we talked about with white collar professions. If that's happening in the medical profession,
Exactly.
what could be more white collar, right? So then when it should apply to every other profession, business and other professional services. I wanted you to expand a little bit on the AI point we mentioned around AI and chatbots as well. I just spent 3 years at the Gates Foundation working with Khan Academy on Khanmigo and the launch of Khanmigo. And a lot of folks in the open market aren't aware of the amount of data plumbing that's necessary to achieve a chatbot that just sits there and responds to the whims and the needs of a student. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing with the AI and the leveraging of this new capability, generative AI, in higher ed.
Yeah, it's a great point. So at the moment, institutions are trying to figure out what to do, essentially. And it's easier to start on the edges of the academic enterprise. So let's use artificial intelligence for delivering answers to things that people ask over and over and over, and it's quicker and easier and faster, and so we get efficiency, we get happy students and so on like that. But it's not really going anywhere near our core enterprise of teaching, learning, and assessment, right? And so that's easy, and a lot of people are doing it. Now, as you say, it's not necessarily right now plug and play. It'll get there very fast. And already there's lots of solutions and things like that. So that's on that side. Embedding, and then we see artificial intelligence and generative AI particularly being used, I would say, still in the early adopter sort of zone. And this is lots and lots, thousands of minute experiments, individuals or groups of individuals testing, building a lesson plan or creating quiz questions or, making their life a little easier, perhaps, summarizing things. Of course, students are all using these technologies, but I'm talking about the institution themselves. So it's still in sort of mass experimentation phase. The vast majority of institutions have not delivered any sort of deep strategic policy, framework, strategy for the integration and use of artificial intelligence inside their core enterprise. That's where we're at now. To some extent, they're not waiting for things like policy and technical security because even those things aren't in place. Some, however, the ones are on the edge, the ones that are already sort of further ahead, are developing much more deep use cases. So, for example, one example, a university in Germany, Germany's largest university, has delivered, it is a chatbot, but it's delivered the chatbot, it's designed and built, but it's all around curriculum and content. And so it's built as basically its own, sort of data area, pool of data for everything in the institution, content, assessment, everything, all courses, every single bit of content has been vetted by academics in the institution. So you can ask it that, you can ask this tool any question about the content of any course or assessment or anything like that, and it'll deliver. It's sort of like your personal chat GPT, so to speak. We're going to see quite a bit of that because universities want to build their own. They don't want students necessarily seeking answers for things academically, just basically by trolling the world's information. They want to pull that into their own content, not just single universities, but we see groups of universities collaboratively getting together and saying, okay, we've got a lot of IP, we've got a lot of content, and it's great content in terms of our curriculum. So what if all that content was in our own ring-fenced generative AI tool? That would be amazing. And then we could be sure about what students are using. And so that's the sort of thing we're seeing.
That's fascinating and exciting because, it definitely can transform learning at an institution or a collection of institutions at a certain level and a certain level of quality.
Exactly.
Just for folks that in our institution that are watching this, what's really been relevant here, one of our leaders on the Accelerate side has shown me how they're using generative AI to actually study our curriculum and map it against skills. So our desired future state of being a skills-oriented university requires us to understand the underlying skills in every course. And as we kind of redesign our course and curriculum for 2030, we're already building our own skill taxonomy that we want to apply to everything we do in terms of learning and training. And we're doing that in-house to create our own. We want our own proprietary view of how does this degree break down into 6,000 skills? And then at what level are these skills taught at? And then how do you map it against another degree that may break down to 5,000 skills? So it's a very granular approach. But what it allows you to do then is to use it like a Rosetta Stone to map to the world of work. Because it's like we said that there needs to be a translation between our degree, one degree with so many courses that the students completed, to, well, what skills have they actually learned and what are the skills that a job requires, and then to map the two together. So that work is already underway here.
I think that is incredibly important. One of the wonderful strengths of any institution, like individual institutions and universities at large, have got a very broad and deep footprint. And so it's a devolved network. Individual academics doing amazing things with their students in class, but times a million around the world. But then that's very grounded and context-based and wonderful. Hard to break that, right? But at the same time, the downside of that is that all the knowledge and everything is right down at the local level. It's hard to map. Curriculum mapping of even courses to graduate outcomes and now the language of skills is super impossible just without this technology. And so this is one of the areas where, I think there's a great use case for these artificial intelligence to map across without it's almost impossible for humans to do it, just given the volume of data and the devolved, disintermediated sort of uh, location of all this information.
Correct. Yeah, it's exciting times and great things happening there. Yeah, so I'll start off on the UMGC Ventures side. We've focused our efforts, or decided to focus our efforts over the next 5 years on this area around workforce, and the changes that are happening with this shift. We believe that we have to help the university create this alternative pathway by wading into this world of, in some cases, lower quality credentials and certificates, so that we can create a safe alternative pathway for a student. And the way that that would work would be using what I just alluded to, this mapping to a skills taxonomy, a common skills taxonomy with the university, and working with the academic team at the university to verify quality of outcome, so that we can, with confidence, go to an employer and say, a student who's taken an alternative pathway and earned these stackable certificates is just as good as a student who's done 2 years of college, left university for a while, accepted a job, and has the same level of skill. So we should be able to articulate that in the marketplace, and that's one of our kind of vision points. It's like, can we actually successfully achieve that? By doing that, you will now create this new pathway, and we think that it took us 70 years for UMGC to reach 100,000 students. As we do this on the venture side, we'll get there much quicker, but we'll be at a much lower tuition fee per student per year, because we're looking at working learners that are tapping into funding that may be available by their employer, and most employers tap that at $4,000 or $5,000 a year. So there's a much lower pool of money that's available, but it's employer-driven versus federal funding-driven. But you have a longer lifetime value. So we're trying to think, how do we create then the ability for an individual to cobble together multiple credentials to lead to a better career outcome or an escalating career outcome? As they earn more credentials, they improve their ability to earn at work. So that's a big part of our thinking. But to do that, we're going to have to drive a lot of experimentation on the side, working in collaboration with the university. And that's kind of how we see our next 5 years mapping out. And I'm right now embarking on putting that team together.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, one of the things about the ventures model, it's a vehicle for concentrated effort. Everybody in the university is super busy delivering the things that they're delivering, right? You need concentrated effort, and sort of a focus on those things. At the same time, these models are best when they're 1 foot in the institution and 1 foot out. Because if you're fully in, then it's hard to look at new things, right? But if you're fully out, then you're not going to bring the institution along. And so this sort of on the edge, innovation occurs lots of times right on the edges. So there's sort of this model where you're very, very connected in, but sort of also outwards, and making those connections, I think, is incredibly important. It's the connection point between them, and so well what's happening in the organization, where their strengths are and what is not able to be compromised, or not, you don't want to compromise. That's a university knowing what it's really, really good at and not compromising on it, but applying it in new products and new markets and for new students. I mean, 100,000 students is, I don't know how many alumni, but very, very many who are super loyal to your organization, your institution. And so what do they need? And so there's all these opportunities, but you do need that concentrated effort in order to take that forward.
And what I wanted to ask you is, have you come across other models? Because we're looking at in the US only, but if you've seen globally any models that we can actually learn from and follow, of universities that are doing innovation well, so that we can actually study them on our own.
Yeah, it's super interesting. What we see is what we have seen is an era of more external, because sometimes institutions will eat up and destroy anything that's trying to disrupt, right? I mean, that's normal. And so you build this sort of group outside to beaver away and make a business, and then with the objective sometime of bringing that back into the institution, and sometimes it never happens, and sometimes it does. And so, but I would say the era of externalizing innovation is coming to an end. We saw and have seen over the last 10 years some good examples there. But now we're seeing institutions saying, whoa, hang on, innovation in our model, in our, our students, our programs, rethinking that. This is core to our DNA. We need to own this. And we are seeing that. And I do love the system-wide approach, not individual institution. Individual institutions, unless they've got massive endowments, shall remain nameless, but unless they've got massive endowments, most institutions individually are not going to be able to, on their own, make the changes required at fundamental levels. So system-wide approaches, the University of Texas system and the way they're thinking about it. It links back to what you were talking about in the Department of Education, the Department of Labor and Economic Development sort of getting together. Well, this is the university system getting together with, their state sort of stakeholders and making together changes, which I think this is also your approach. We're seeing networks of universities, either because they're pulled together by a state or connected together because of other things, the ASEAN network of, universities and things like that. Definitely we're seeing that. And this is actually one of those very, very unique strengths of universities, their ability to collaborate together. You don't usually see that in a commercial market, but it is a strength of the university models that they are really easy to collaborate.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of what I'm trying to do too, is to kind of like really embrace others and learn from others. Even though we compete in some way with others, we admire what Southern New Hampshire and WGU Labs is doing. And we actually share ideas, ASU as well. So there's this idea of co-opetition. How do we cooperate but yet compete in an active market where these changes are going to be valued?
Yeah, I think that every person I've ever spoken to at a university, and that's over many years and thousands of universities, it's important that they are sustainable. It's important that they are, that the university continues. But the higher purpose will always win out over a commercial decision. Now, there's good and bad to that. But that means that anyone at those universities you mentioned, or any university, will share and help because it's for the higher purpose, which all universities around the world share. That's very powerful.
Yes, the idea that a university's raw material are the students, and the students come into an institution and we enhance their lives by elevating thinking. All of the design around the student experience is around elevating thinking, elevating that human being to a higher potential.
Exactly.
That's what drives us, because then you look at that student 5 years on, 10 years on, you say, like, was I able to impact that student's life? Was I able to help them achieve a higher level of success in their lives? And that's what drives us. That's why we're here. It's the kind of the mission of the institution. We do it for the state of Maryland, but others do it for whatever region or country that they're in. But the exciting part is that we also have to respond to the market. We can't do that in isolation. Like the ivory towers analogy would be, we know how to do this. We've got this. We've done it, as you said, the same way for 100 years and we're good, without ever looking outside of the ivory tower to realize that, oh my gosh, what we thought was the best thing for the student may not necessarily be the best thing for the world beyond. And that's important now for us to really appreciate and understand that is shifting. Therefore, we must shift so that we can better serve that individual.
Right, exactly. Traditional models serve traditional purposes, but if the world is changing, then models change. So, yeah.
Yep.